I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, we're back again with the second in our two-part mini-series, interrupting our mini-series on weird poetry to talk about two poems from two collections of poetry that were written by Chinese Americans in 1911 and 1915 in San Francisco's Chinatown. They're kind of composed in a mixture of Cantonese and Wen, the classical Chinese. We talked a bit about their historical situation last week on the last podcast. Rob, you're waving your hand like a good child like Hermione in Harry Potter.
Ooh, I have something. Can I talk? You have to say yes.
Yes, Rob.
Lee's not telling me. All right. I waited a long time for that. Yes, that was pretty ominous. You said we're interrupting our weird poetry series, but in a way, we're not. Because the poem we're talking about today...
Very meta.
It's so weird. In the context of Chinese tradition, and you will know in a minute why I'm referencing that, this poem is bizarre. Like, it should not have been written. It's so weird.
He's saying something that has never, I think, been said in the Chinese tradition, because the poem is about, let's just go ahead and jump into it, Rob.
Go ahead and read it. Go ahead and read it. Yep.
The poem is about deciding which is more important, a son or having money. Now, in the Chinese tradition, that comes down to us that it's frequently referred to as Confucianism, although I would say that that's probably not that much to do with Confucius, but in traditional Chinese thinking, having a son who continues the line, that's the ultimate, that's the sine qua non. A lot of Chinese literature is arranged around giving birth to a son. Rob, Could you read the poem for us?
I will. Here we go. A son or money, which is more precious? On top, of course, is money. Without money, liberty and rights are beyond your means. Parents take care of a son, but money takes care of your skin. Money is everything. What's more convenient than having money on a spending spree? A son wastes his father's money. Nothing unusual about that indeed, but a father can only drool in vain over his son's money. You know, Lee, I'm reading an online column dealing with number one hits from the Billboard Hot 100, and I just finished reading a column about the notorious B.I.G., Biggie Smalls. This feels like it could come out of a song, like a rap song in the early to mid 90s. It totally could.
This is maybe a Qing Dynasty rap song. Yeah, I mean it's celebrating money over the thing that's in normative Chinese culture, that is, what is expected traditionally. You have to have a son, but no, not here.
Well, and even some of the terms are similar, right? Let's see. Without money, liberty and rights are beyond your means. What it's saying is, that's fine. You could carry on the line and all, but you know what? I'll tell you what. When you don't have any money, having a son just is another mouth to feed. It doesn't really matter,
It's
if you really want to be
money.
free, if you really want to be free, if you really want to have the kind of life that freedom allows you to have, you got to have money. That's what it's saying, right? Kind of makes sense why you would want to rap about having a lot of money.
I think it's interesting that you're comparing it to 1990s American rappers, because that line, without money, liberty and rights are beyond your means, I think it evokes this quintessentially American idea where it's kind of a Horatio Alger poem, right? Like, you have to have money in America. And I think that's what makes this so fascinating, is because you can see this choice between a son or money as a choice between a traditional Chinese way of thinking versus a traditional American way of thinking. And he's choosing the American way. I mean, one of the reasons we're doing these poems right now is because it's Asian American History Month. And I think that this poem, for me, is really fascinating, just because it's crazy how American his thinking is, right? Like, it's written in this literary Chinese mixed with Cantonese, but it's so dang American, like the choice.
Yeah, and it is, in the sense, at least, that why did immigrants come to America? They didn't come because, by golly, they sure did want to be able to say whatever they really thought. They came because there were so many opportunities to make the kind of life you wanted to make, that it made sense, right? Which is another way of saying for money. I mean, it would be phrased a little differently now, but that's certainly what animates this person. And one of the things that's interesting about it is it points to why, say, a Chinese American identity can be hard to articulate. Because, yes, there is this tradition this person is coming out of that's supposed to be quote-unquote Confucian. I mean, that's obviously what the poem is sort of playing off of. But as it moves on, as the culture moves on, it's a lot more than that, right? So this is a person who, because of where they've arrived in America, they have a choice that they've never really been able to make before. I mean, I can't even imagine a poem being written in the late 19th, early 20th centuries in China, a Chinese poet saying, you know what? I don't want to have a son. I want cash. I can't even fathom that being written. But it makes sense in the context of a community of immigrants where people are going, hang on, why do I have to have a son? Now that I'm not in China anymore, why do I have to do this?
These authors, these poets, were living in this very male community. So like much of the West, and that's West as in the American West, not the Euro-American West. Throughout the West, you have these large communities of men with these outsized ratios of men to women. So there are way more men than there are women. Of course, the reason for that in San Francisco's Chinatown is not just because of the mining boom, but also because women aren't allowed into America. Generally, it's very difficult for a Chinese woman to come into the U.S. Most of the women who did come into the U.S. were trafficked and usually forced to work as prostitutes. And so I kind of wonder, I mean, we have no way of going back to it, but I kind of wonder, is this poet making this choice partially because he's sort of coming up with instead of being resigned and being like, oh, I can't have a son because there's one woman per 50 men or whatever it is. He's sort of taking that and turning it around and celebrating it like, I don't want a son. I want money. Make it rain.
Right. But again, because he's no longer where he was. We say he. It almost has to be a he.
It has to be a he. There's no chance.
It pretty much has to be. Yeah. Statistically and legally, it pretty much has to be a he. Yeah. But that's a fascinating thing that the last poem we did was this chafing under the unequal laws. But there are people who got through, and those that got through, a lot of them did discover that they didn't necessarily have to do all the same things just because that's the way everyone did them. You know what? There are a lot of other people. Like everyone has to have a son.
Right. Like the same things that they had done in China.
Yeah, exactly. The same things they had done in China. Right.
I think the thing that strikes me most about this is how American this poem is. You know, we looked last week at the sort of problems that America had in dealing with these immigrants and putting them essentially in jails on Angel Island. But it's important to realize that it wasn't all bad, right? Like these Chinese folks became very American, and they came and I'm just going to say it. They sort of celebrated the capitalistic nature of America, and maybe in a way that sort of spikes the ball on traditional Chinese culture, right, Rob?
Yeah, I think that's one way to put it. You know, it's interesting though that we're talking about this being quintessentially American because the going somewhere because it's a good opportunity makes sense in the American context, but what it means to be American also begins to change at points like this, because let's just make money doesn't mean the same thing when you have a community of people who are coming from another country and grappling with what that means according to their tradition. That all gets poured into this shared sense of what it means to be American, which is one of the reasons why the dialogues today are so complicated, because I think sometimes there's an assumption on the part of some people that quote-unquote being American means a set of concrete propositions. But the moment you start asking about historical context and color and things like that, it starts to get a lot more complicated. Frankly, that's one of the things I like most about America, is that it is as complicated as this, that in our history, we have poems like this with someone going, okay, so I'm aware of the tradition I came from, and that's fine. But actually, I don't really want to do that anymore. That one thing. That's such a fascinating dynamic, and that's a part of who we are.
It's the sort of Jay Gatsby, right? Like he turns his back on everything traditional and just celebrates wealth.
And yet, that's a great reference actually. And again, if we were to do a bunch more poems in this collection, you would find there are contrasting thoughts on this making money. Like about just about everything. And to me, that's one of the things that makes this history so rich is that you can't really peg any of it down. This guy was like, give me cash, man. Other people are not thinking that way.
And in the book that we're drawing from, the collection of these poems that have been translated into English, it's Songs of Gold Mountain by Marlon K. Holm. There's this whole chapter it's called Rhapsodies on Gold, and it's just about celebrating wealth. So it's not like this is a one-off. I think this is probably one of my favorites in this chapter. But there are lots of different poems. There were a lot of poets who were like, "Show me the money." When they got to America, they talk about striking it rich, either in gambling or getting lots of gold and things. It's this poem is part of this fascinating collection that it's tough to get, but I think it should probably be better known, right, Rob?
Yeah, I do too. It's a really interesting one.
There are sections on being detained in immigration. There are also chapters on Chinese poets' involvement with prostitution, a bunch of really random topics. Missing home. You have a chapter on that's written, the poems written from the perspective of the wives, which I assume most of those are written by the husbands who have taken the perspective of their wives back at home in South China. But we don't actually know that. Those could possibly have been written by women who were in the U.S.
Yeah. So it's a fascinating collection.
And we'll put this poem, and I'll do a translation of the poem onto the website. Check it out, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Anything else, Rob?
That's all I've got.
I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.